It is my great honor to introduce Dr. Carolyn Jacobs. She was Dean of the School of Social Work at Smith College, one of the foremost social work schools in the country. She developed a program in mindfulness and social work that was absolutely pioneering and really important. She has been active on the Naropa Board of Directors with the Association for Contemplative Mind in Higher Education, and was acting president?
Interim for Mind and Life, yeah.
Oh, not acting, interim president for the Mind and Life Institute. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Jacobs.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to be with you, and it's always fascinating to be at the end because one of the things that I discovered, I have the valued experience of having listened to a number of speakers and thinking about what I might say at this end as you are dealing with having absorbed a lot of content and not having a chance, I don't think, except you may have done it over dinner and meals and individually, but not collectively, to process some of that. So I'm going to think in terms of a dynamic this morning. I will say some things because I posed the question for this talk, which is diversity and inclusion in contemplative studies. How are we addressing the challenge? Which doesn't mean how am I addressing the challenge, and it doesn't mean how those folks out there are addressing the challenge. The we is in the room, and the we that I draw on this morning is the wisdom that each one of you brings to this room, which comes from a multitude of disciplinary sources, your own education, your own teaching experience. So I'm talking really with those of you who taught at least one course or more in the course of your career, because what I will do is make some comments and then we'll move into a reflective writing session in which I'm going to ask you a question about how did you have a challenge with students or colleagues around diversity and inclusion. And then I'm going to ask you to share in dyads and then open it up. Well, closing will be the opening discussion to generate the wisdom and the energy of the room. For those of you who are students who have not taught a course, I'm going to ask you just to gather in a smaller group and you will have a different discussion on what it's like to be a student in a room. But I won't put you both together in dyads because this is an opportunity for the faculty who've come to a think tank, who are looking at what they're going to carry back, to find that kind of peer support group to work together. So I was trying to think about it. The wealth of diversity material is out there. You go on the website, you'll find it, all right? You'll find it by your disciplines and in teaching and learning centers all over this country. They've generated those resources. Talking with people on your campus that are doing it, I strongly invite you to engage in brown bag lunches or however you do it with colleagues along the way to generate those resources. What I find is the most difficult thing is after we do it, then what do we do with it in the classroom setting? And what happens if it goes off the deep end, okay? I just need to correct Hal a bit. I did the course on contemplative practice and clinical social work practice because it wasn't just mindfulness techniques, because social workers who are in mental health areas were interested in coming and generating techniques, okay, to apply to work with clients about, okay? Part of what I discovered with the crew early on in my first class is they came without any meditation experience, but this desire to meditate. And we spent the year, and I heard more stories about how they couldn't find the time to meditate, and I realized fundamentally we had an issue because you cannot give what you do not have. And if you do not have a sense of grounding, standing up to teach, to talk with students about it, put you in that extraordinarily awkward position of where are my boundaries on this? Where am I going with this? What's stirring up in me with this? And then you add the area of intersectionality on top of it, the whole sense of inclusion and diversity and the conversation, and you're just sitting there frozen in a way. Then you go to a faculty meeting or a faculty luncheon and say, by the way, this is what's happening, and people go, well, don't you know better, or shut you down entirely out of their own fear oftentimes of not having explored deeply. So I'm going to spend a bit of time this morning also knowing that we've had a very different kind of experience, and I like a little energy because one of the things as an African-American woman, and those of you who've heard me speak before know this, it's that sense of I am because you are. And if I don't get the energy from you, none of us exist, okay? So I'm gonna start with someone who has extraordinary energy, and had and still does, even these years after her death. And it's Maya Angelou in the Pulse of the Morning, the inaugural speech that she gave for Bill Clinton. So I'm just gonna cue that up. I think I am. If I can avoid Siri and all of that and just go to.
A rock, a river, a tree, hosts to species long since departed, marked the mastodon, the dinosaur, who left dry tokens of their sojourn here on our planet floor. Any broad alarm of their hastening doom is lost in the gloom of dust and ages. But today, the rock cries out to us, clearly, forcefully, come, you may stand upon my back and face your distant destiny, but seek no haven in my shadow. I will give you no hiding place down here. You, created only a little lower than the angels, have crouched too long in the bruising darkness, have lain too long face down in ignorance, your mouths spilling words armed for slaughter. The rock cries out to us today, you may stand upon me, but do not hide your face. Across the wall of the world, a river sings a beautiful song. It says, come, rest here by my side. Each of you, a bordered country, delicate and strangely made, proud, yet thrusting perpetually under siege. Your armed struggles for profit have left collars of waste upon my shore, currents of debris upon my breast. Yet today, I call you to my riverside, if you will study war no more. Come, clad in peace, and I will sing the songs the Creator gave to me when I and the tree and the rock were one. Before cynicism was a bloody sear across your brow, and when you yet knew, you still knew nothing. The river sang and sings on. There is a true yearning to respond to the singing river and the wise rock. So say the Asian, the Hispanic, the Jew, the African, the Native American, the Sioux, the Catholic, the Muslim, the French, the Greek, the Irish, the rabbi, the priest, the sheik, the gay, the straight, the preacher, the privileged, the homeless, the teacher. They all hear the speaking of the tree. They hear the first and last of every tree speak to humankind today. Come to me, here beside the river. Plant yourself beside the river. Each of you, descendant of some passed-on traveler, has been paid for. You who gave me my first name, you Pawnee, Apache, Seneca, you Cherokee Nation, who rested with me, then forced on bloody feet, left me to the employment of other seekers, desperate for gain, starving for gold. You the Turk, the Arab, the Swede, the German, the Eskimo, the Scot, you the Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Kru, bought, sold, stolen, arriving on a nightmare, praying for a dream. Here, root yourselves beside me. I am that tree planted by the river which will not be moved. I the rock, I the river, I the tree, I am yours. Your passages have been paid. Lift up your faces. You have a piercing need for this bright morning dawning for you. History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Lift up your eyes upon this day breaking for you. Give birth again to the dream. Women, children, men, take it into the palms of your hands. Mold it into the shape of your most private need. Sculpt it into the image of your most public self. Lift up your hearts. Each new hour holds new chances for new beginnings. Do not be wedded forever to fear, yoked eternally to brutishness. The horizon leans forward, offering you space to place new steps of change. Here, on the pulse of this fine day, you may have the courage to look up and out and upon me, the rock, the river, the tree, your country. No less to Midas than the mendicant, no less to you now than the mastodon then. Here, on the pulse of this new day, you may have the grace to look up and out and into your sister's eyes and into your brother's face, your country, and say simply, very simply, with hope, good morning.
One word that stood out for you. Just speak the one word. Other words. Rock, hope, river, stability, alive, tree. Good morning. She spoke that at Clinton's inauguration in 1993. How much of that is still alive in that hope in us? And I think for me, the word tree stood out because if we think about Seemind's work in contemplative mind and society and the contemplative tree, we are rooted in awareness, connection, and communion. And that coming together gives us a particular energy out of which we can work and teach and practice. And so from Rumi, look for the answer inside your question. And maybe you are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots. And so when I said the question, how are we addressing the challenge? We unpack questions. You know, we teach our students to do that, and hopefully we do that with our lives. So inside the questions, there are always a set of assumptions. Challenge, which is both a danger and an opportunity. How we address it is important to the end effect of crisis or opportunity to change. But that sense of we, who is the we in this addressing issues of diversity and inclusion in contemplative studies? who is not included around the table of we, And that's one of those things. You look around the room and you just sort of go, okay, I know a little bit about the intersectionality that's been described and what people have shared, but who's not in the we in 2017 in this room when we talk about diversity and inclusion in contemplative studies? The assumption is that we believe it's important, that contemplative studies has something to give to this world in a very focused way that will carry our students and us well into the future. And the other thing that we have to talk about at some point is what are the personal and professional costs and benefits for doing this work. I remember in the early 90s, or late 80s, actually, the School for Social Work, I was on the faculty. We decided as a faculty to become an institution with an anti-racism commitment. And I sat there looking at my colleagues, 17 or 18 of us around the table. I said, do you know what this is going to cost? And social workers in their idealistic way, and nobody wanting to be seen as a racist who wouldn't join in with this effort said, oh, Carolyn, I said, there is a cost when you make that kind of commitment. There is an expectation of students, of your colleagues, and I would hope of yourself. And we struggled for years with the cost of what it meant to sit, look at curriculum. The big challenge of a faculty is to have your peers, particularly once you become tenured, this isn't enough about, to have your peers look at your syllabi and say, that's not going to cut it, okay? That became the cost of ego around the table. And every time I moved to that position of being stuck, I remember becoming dean, and I said, if we're not going to enact this, we need to vote to not do it. You would vote to not do it? I said, why would I try to give energy to something that I don't have faculty support for? Well, they shaped up with that one. It's an interesting thing when you say to people, okay, you don't want to do it? Let's stop talking about it. So part of it is looking at that. Critically thinking about and discerning the implication of these assumptions and others are important as you respond to the question and reflect on designing a diverse, inclusive, contemplative studies classroom. Faculty needs to find communities and processes to explore and understand your own identities, views, biases, and values. For those of you who have teaching and learning centers, this is a great resource, or other kinds of gatherings. Getting to the roots of these views, biases, and values is a lifetime journey. We are constantly adjusting to the unique perspectives on diversity and inclusion that our students invite us to. This world has changed the language since I first started teaching in the late 70s. It was black, white, and particularly where I was coming from. When I was in California, there was a sense of a Mexican population, but we still talked black-white in the 60s, early 70s. When I moved for doctoral studies to Brandeis, and I taught my first class, it was fascinating to me, when I was doing research, one, to look at, when I was looking at demographics and talking about Asians, African Americans, Hispanics, and whites, Caucasians, I stopped. And people said, oh no, you're in Boston. You got to talk about Irish, Italian. You also have, you have to run through most of the Eastern European countries in order to deal with the categories. And I thought, well, this is something. First time I taught at Boston University, and I was in a class, and I got into a discussion in terms of communities and social context. I said, well, issues with interracial marriage, with Puerto Ricans and whites and blacks and whites. And somebody raised their hand and said, no, you don't understand the complications of mixed marriages in Boston. And I said, what are you talking about? Italian Catholic and Irish Catholic. And I went down the path in the room of the number of them who were talking about the reality of family members not being able to marry until grandparents died. So they talked about aunts and uncles who had married well into their 50s or 60s. I had to do a real shift in terms of my understanding of diversity, coming from California, walking into Boston and teaching in a Boston university at that time. Now I suspect it's expanded a lot in terms of what they would see as sending up the flags around mixed marriages at that point. So when you begin to look at your own values and biases, and I've had to struggle with that. I've been on the board of both Naropa University and Elms College, two very different institutions. This is the way I operate life, in that I love being on the margin of all sorts of places and things, because it's sort of like, it's gone from margin to center, but I find that I just redefine the center for me and don't engage with being on the margin in that way, because it's fascinating to learn from marginality and to really understand how you can move in and around and open yourself up to new possibilities and to grow in all sorts of ways. But it is a challenge, the challenge around finding the right language to use these days around gender issues in speaking. And so I get myself all in quite a little loop-de-loop because I'm not in the classroom and I'm not dealing with students as directly as I did, so I'm not as current as I need to be, should be, in terms of an awareness these days. So that work is ongoing. It's a lifetime journey. We're constantly invited to update syllabi, research, social, political context of our world and the impact of our teaching. We now bring a critical stance to looking at the assumptions under research designs that have gotten increasingly refined and have helped us to look at how you then measure the impact of a mindfulness practice, and you haven't done it with a diverse community. Yet you're saying this works well across communities of color, of low income status, et cetera, et cetera. We need to be very cautious about what we do as we rush to publish. So to create an inclusive learning environment throughout the curriculum and in our fields, we should consider how we are incorporating or aware of diversity in courses and how we can become more inclusive in our teaching. How are we including multiple perspectives? And I'm often, struck by the fact, as we started doing it at Smith and in other places, we always found that diversity week, where everybody had a lecturer or there was something on the syllabi, and we thought, well, we've taken care of that. We've now moved further to say, what is the critique we need to bring to research that underlies the conceptual basis and frameworks of our teaching and our research? What are the assumptions about the person, and how does that leave out or restrict identities? And so I moved to that which I said I was going to do, which was to engage you in a process. So the question that I put before those of you who are faculty is, a student or colleague encounter where your understanding and skills in working with diversity and inclusion in the classroom or with the faculty are challenged. So a student or colleague, just sit and think for a moment about a student or a colleague where your work, as you attempted to fulfill an intention of working with the diversity and inclusion in the classroom was challenged and you feel frustrated by it. So I'm going to ask you to take the next 5 minutes or so and sketch that out. For the students in the room, think about when you've been in a classroom where you thought there may have been a diversity issue that should have been explored and it wasn't. So if you think about, or on campus, if you think about that for 5 minutes. So I'm asking you to write a brief description and how you felt about it. Okay? What was most important? What was relevant? What was the impact on you? What was important? What was relevant? What was the impact on you? What did you learn from it? And what are the unfinished areas of learning as you think about developing contemplative studies curriculum that is diverse and inclusive? So you're clearly articulating what the issue is. You're clearly stating what was important about the issue for you. What did you learn about it from the issue? And what's there? Still waiting to, calling to be understood, to be learned about. So let's take 5 or so minutes to do that, and then we'll have a chance. I'll let you know when you can grab a colleague and have a conversation about what you're writing. Let's see, are you ready to go into dyads pretty much? People pretty? Okay, fine. Well, you can put a pause to it. Find one other person, and we'll spend the next 6 minutes. Give each one of you take 3 minutes to share what's going on with you. I'm mindful of moving us on to the time. Yeah, in your dyad, you're focusing on that unlearned piece. See, you need another group. So I'm interested. Any comments, reactions to what you've just begun to engage in? Anything anybody'd like to share? Yes.
I'm really curious about the current political environment and how it's bringing up certain kinds of... How it's legitimizing certain points of view in the classroom that I haven't seen in years. And just wondering if this could be something that others are experiencing. There, just a certain kind of permission to voice a certain white privilege, aggression, racism in the classroom that I'm just wondering if this is something others are experiencing.
Anyone else? Yes, Ram.
So Michigan prides itself for being a diverse place. And the opening week, we had a major graffitis, tarnishing every ethnic group you can think of. So it's a major event. And so campus, we are going to have a big meeting next week. We already have a few meetings with students. So it's really a lot of things politically unacceptable before become more fashionable. And it's really a difficult time to think about diversity and inclusion in higher education.
Others?
I haven't experienced that at all. And maybe partly it's because, we had people die in August, and so it was very raw, but I've more experienced the opposite.
Also, I think that's true here, although I can double check with students. I don't think there's been a doubling down on white students' sense of white privilege and insisting on it. But there's been more openness and sympathy with diversity and inclusion efforts.
So Judith, I just wanted to comment on that a little because in 2014, around the whole boycott divestment against Israel, that's when things really hit like a powder keg on our campus because we have very active students who were trying to sort of bully people into their position. There was an international trip that was planned where they were going to go to Israel and Palestine, but it had to do with earth studies. So it wasn't a political trip. They were going to study water, and they were going to these different places. So a number of students got wind of this, and they proceeded to go to this professor's class that was sponsoring the trip and basically, shame people into, how can you take this trip? You need to drop out of this right now. This is not right for you to do. And the way in which they did it caused and created fear because people were feeling like their physical safety was being threatened. So that then opened up this whole thing about civil discourse and, setting the terms for actually rules that would guide us in having these discussions, because that was clearly inappropriate. If a student or a faculty member is feeling unsafe because you're expressing your opinion in such a way that they feel threatened. So for the last couple of years, we've had what's been known as Dialogue Across Differences, was basically funding open to anyone who wanted to bring speakers, who wanted to do trainings. So through that, I had actually set up a campus-wide training for nonviolent communication. And we kept that going with the Carolyn Grant Endowment. So we did the second level of NVC training through that. So that's, sort of like how we've had to work through the situation.
So my question is, in a classroom setting like that, the particular situation that I'm dealing with is a class of all men, and I'm a woman professor, and I'm wondering whether there has been more sense that this is an acceptable way to speak in an environment with a woman professor with all male students. I'm just curious about the dynamics of this. And this may be, interesting. That people feel unsafe, because this is a learning community. And so that message has to be kept going, reinforced in every class. So the professors are now at the beginning of it laying out the ground rules for what is quote unquote a safe space. Even though we know that there is no truly safe space, they're still setting down these guidelines because of the fact that it did get out of hand. So we're saying express your opinion, you can do so, with passion, but there are certain lines that you should not cross into people's personal space, into, shaming and blaming, because that does not encourage dialogue.
I think one of the fascinating opportunities these days is for us to get ahead of what we see. We see this generation of young people coming who've been educated by social media and also given permission as a result to say the most awful, insensitive things and outrageous and racist and homophobic things to each other in that kind of way. So what happens to a campus? How do we get a handle on that and ahead of that? And I think contemplative studies has the access and a way to do it. So I'm going to tout Naropa and the 4 pillars of contemplative pedagogy, because I think you have looked at some ways that can hold an educational enterprise during very difficult times. And they are contemplative practice, diversity, sustainability, and artistic expression. If you look at what are the pillars of your program, what are the values that you're trying to instill in the base of your program, you will find these provide ways to weave some of the education and awareness and connectivity and training for our students within a way that looks at it educationally and educationally soundly. So if you move ahead in the planning of that and in the structure, I always, as dean, I spent time saying, okay, campus is going to blow up around some issue this summer. How do and I very clearly was into saying, how do I get enough credit in the bank early on when I need to draw on it? I can deal with students upset, faculty upset, and let the administrators know I'm in charge, okay? And I went through that process every year, and I alerted trustees. I said, things may happen. Well, they were always had to go, and you're going to manage it, Carolyn. I thought, yeah, I'll manage it. But I want you to know, because I wanted to make sure who needed to have my back in regards to anything happening, to know that I was aware and the analysis was there. So if we have the kind of grounding in contemplative practice and studies in a way that looks at the responsiveness to the changing ecological field, to the changing environment, to the needs of students, and our own needs? How do we give space for faculty and staff who feel bombarded as well? And we know it's going to happen, folks. Let's get over this idea that, suffering in this way is not going to occur. The issue is, how are we grounded in our own practice in ways that we can share being grounded with others, or being the Sangha or the community that people need? And some simple ways, but some very direct ways of knowing that. The issue is of engaging in the dialogue and an awareness of the intersectionality issues that come up, because our identities will be challenged going and coming. So how do I protect when I was the junior faculty? Because I knew they would be vulnerable, and that senior faculty would just go, well, they're out there, let them deal with it, all right? How do I provide that kind of environment with colleagues, in a way, to have those good conversations, but anchoring it in the conceptual framework of the academy is what's critical, so that we're not just reacting. We're going to react, I'm going to react to something, but my idea is I'm going to try and use my intellect and experience and wisdom sufficiently to say, okay, I've taken care of these things. I can hang in with others. And so, having grown up in the 60s and taken over buildings, that was part of it, and I had my faculty at that time say to me, wait till you start teaching. I never believed that would happen, all right? So when students came to take over the building that I was the administrator of, I said, welcome. Open the doors, engaged in the dialogue, until they got tired of talking to me and went on back to class. One of that sense of openness and engagement, but I thought, we're not closing down the school because of this, because education must occur. But I must respond, because you are another human being. Not only that, but you are someone that I am responsible for in educating you to be presence in the world today. So my commitment to education was, how do I practice as a contemplative administrator in ways that can hold the community, also hold it accountable? Because it didn't mean that everybody was going to get everything, but they were going to have to learn how to live together in community. And so I had a thing with students. I'd walk across campus, I'd see them, and I'd say to students, good morning. And if people didn't say good morning back to me, I would stop them and say, what's wrong? Something up? So they learn how to talk to me and make the connection to not engage with that. But that was getting credit in the bank. Because what they would say to each other outside of the faculty circles is that Dean Jacobs is available and will speak to us. And that's all I needed in order to manage difficult times. Because they will be there, they're going to come, and we have in contemplative studies an extraordinary resource to provide the kind of leadership in the sciences and research and in ecology and in the social engagement arenas that can be a part of making this a better world. And I am 4 minutes over what I should do, so thank you all.